Welcome back, all nine of you, hopefully, to week three of Drama Online in these COVID 19 times. So, this week we're going to we're officially going to start off looking at cultural forms, which is in section two of your syllabus. So, these are things that you're going to be using your knowledge both in writing and in making performances as well, because your improvisation exams, one of the requirements is that it must include a cultural form, or at least that used to be the requirement. So let's just start off by looking at the syllabus, which you all should have printed out by now. But if not, it doesn't really matter because it's available online for you. I put it in the class folder as well as a Google Drive folder, which I shared before. So we are looking at section 2, which is on pages 18 to 20. First thing we're going to look at is the definition and examples. Then we move on to number 2, which is the elements, physical and symbolic. And we skip to number 5, which is the impact of these cultural forms on theatre arts in the territory in which they are found or in the region in general. And then we go to number 6, which is the impact of the cultural form on society, economy, history, culture. And then 7, which would be the relationship to contemporary slash popular culture. So let us just move quickly to defining cultural forms and giving a few examples so we understand what exactly it is we are going to be looking at. So, according to the syllabus, cultural forms refers to aesthetic practices derived from and identified with particular communities and cultures in the Caribbean. So, this is just a very drawn out word to say these are the things that particular groups of people in the Caribbean will share and practice. So, that keyword, the aesthetic, is just having to do with art, having to do with beauty, having to do with creativity. So, anything creative that a certain group of people or community of people in the Caribbean can share, and that is the whole thing about cultures as well. Culture is in itself collective and shared interest. That is what culture is. And the syllabus also outlines that these practices include, which is really all you need to know, rituals, festivals, celebrations, games, music, dances, and language. I just need to pull back up my notes here because I lost them. Right. So, some examples we have ballet dance. You all should be familiar with, if not all, with some of these or most of these, hopefully. So, we have ballet dance is one of them, canboulay reenactment, parang, pagua, storytelling or Nancy stories. Carnival is one of the main ones, one of the easily identifiable ones. Ramlila and Matikur. So we have some that are of African influence, some of East Indian influence. So the examples that I'm giving right now are just examples in Trinidad and Tobago specifically, but there are many examples in the other Caribbean territories. But I'm just giving these ones so you understand it more clearly because these are things that are more apparent to us in Trinidad. So there's also Jose Riot reenactment, the Tobago Speech Band, which you may or may not be familiar with, but you will get to know about it. Limbo, which is indigenous to Trinidad, and Wake or Nine Night, which is also one of the cultural forms. So, just to make sense of everything, the syllabus has outlined for the 2021 exams, which is when you all should be writing exams if COVID behaves itself. We are going to be looking at carnival, wakes, and landship. But that does not mean that we are only going to be looking at these cultural forms. We are going to be looking at a good few of them, so you have a broad knowledge base to write about and to understand. So we'll first and foremost be looking at ones that are relevant to Trinidad and Tobago, and then we'll be looking outwards at other Caribbean islands. Actually, that's a lie, because today we're going to be looking at Landship, which is from Barbados. There we go. So, what is Landship? The first cultural form that we are going to be doing as form for theatre arts. Landship is an indigenous Bajan cultural form. Indigenous meaning that it was it was created in Barbados. It belongs to Barbados. So it started pre-emancipation, but it was only established after emancipation, and became popular in the 1920s. So the name says it all. Basically, it's a ship on land. They're pretending to obviously you cannot have a ship moving on land. A ship needs to move through water, but this is as the name would suggest, a ship on land. So it combines naval practices. Naval meaning having to do with the navy, which is basically like the army, but for water and boats and things like that. So it's a combination of British practices and African practices, or Creole meaning mixed, things that only came about when they came to the Caribbean. So traditionally, each community would have its own landship, um, and they would come together in competitions to win a prize for the best community landship, basically. So if you think about it throughout this entire thing, think about it like it's a march past. That is the simplest example that I can give to get you to understand it, in terms that you are familiar with. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be explaining um, will only really make sense when you see it. So there's a video series on YouTube that's 4 videos, and it is mandatory. You have to watch it, and as when you're done watching it, you will understand it completely. Everything will make sense. But for now, I'm just going to go into explaining it a little bit, and then after this, you'll go and watch the video and make more sense of it. Right, so 2A from the syllabus asks us to look at physical elements. Right. So we're looking at IV, or 1, 4, 5, whatever. Paraphernalia and props. So paraphernalia is just a big word for equipment or anything physical that you need to execute a task. And then props, we know what props are, short for properties. So the thing about the landship, as opposed to other cultural forms, is that the people are like the props. The people are the main part of this practice. So it's not like to say there are many items that are symbolic in the landship, but of course there are still things that need to be present for it to happen. So each community group is called a ship. So it will be a group of people, and they line up in 2 lines, and they respond to calls from the drill master. As I said, when you see videos, when you see pictures, it will all make a whole lot more sense. So this is kind of identifying the paraphernalia, I guess you could say, is the ship, which is really made up of people. It's not a physical thing. It's not a ship that has been built, but the people make up the body of the ship. When you see the video, it'll make sense. And then the engine refers to the musicians or the tuck band. So tuck band is also a cultural form on its own, but right now we're going to look at it in the context of landship, and so is maypole. Maypole is also a cultural form on its own, but you see you have 3 things coming all together at once: the landship, tuck band, and maypole coming together as one cultural form. So the next video I'm going to show you, just in case you don't know what a maypole is. This is a video of actual maypole in Barbados landship. Right. So as you can see, the objective was for them to create a pattern by plaiting in the ribbons on the maypole itself. And there's a dance and, of course, a formation that goes along with it so that the patterns make sense. And then, so at the end of it, they would weave all the way down the pole or weave it back up. As you would have seen, it started off as a plait and then they basically unraveled it. So that is what the maypole is, and it is also a part of the landship performance in many cases. So moving on, physical elements 2 and 3, which would be music and sound. Um, so it's always live music, just as it was in that video just now. The music is live. It's not really recorded or anything like that. And that's also because it's a call and response thing. So the music responds to the people and the people respond to the music and all that jazz. So the tuck band typically consists of a few instruments. So this can vary. They have more modern instruments sometimes. They have older instruments sometimes. But the tuck band just really depends on the personnel that you have. But it typically consists of these instruments, and the drill master, who is the person who calls out the maneuvers, which are the instructions that the ship will follow then. That is the main sound that is involved in landship. So this is a picture of the tuck band. We'll talk about costuming in a little while, but the landship tuck band, for some reason, usually has on these floral, kind of touristy looking shirts. And as I said, this is also a cultural form on its own, but it is also integrated in the landship practice. So moving on to dress as the next physical element. So the ship, which as we just established are the people, are dressed in traditional British Navy uniforms. And the engine, as I said, is dressed in floral shirts. Now, the different uniforms will show who the person is in the ship. So it will show your rank or your role. So whether it's nurse, admiral, captain, inspector, doctor, engineer, all these different positions have different uniforms. And the uniforms kind of vary a little bit between the different ships, but generally it will follow the traditional British Navy. So you have the different distinguishing factors. So the as I said, the costume, the dress will always indicate positions. So you'll have the juniors will wear blue or blue and white, and the older members will be in black and white. And you'll see, just as you'll see with a captain in the Navy, they have a lot of gold, a lot of decoration on them in the same way as it would be in the landship. You'll have nurses having different hats. They'll have the typical nurse garb and so on and so forth. So let's just look at two pictures to make it make sense. So obviously at the bottom here, those are mostly nurses in that picture. At the top you see is a man with a captain's hat. He has gold braids about him, which means that he must be a senior member. And then of course you see the younger ones in blue and white, and then the older ones in black and white. And of course they're free to have their own different little additions according to the different communities. Right, so the next physical element would be movement and dance or dance. So the movements, as I said, think about it like a march past. So the drill master will call out these maneuvers, and the ship knows whatever each maneuver means. So if they say, okay, rough seas, then they're going to respond accordingly and move in formation, similar to if in a march past you said eyes right. Everybody would have practiced and knows exactly what eyes right means, and they know exactly how they're going to get into their eyes right. But in this case, it's less of a march and more of a dance. And the dances the movements are pretty much African inspired, so to speak. And accordingly, some people say that the movement is supposed to reenact the journey from Africa to the Caribbean on the slave ships, so the Middle Passage. But some people say that it's just the movement of any ship. And this is because some of the maneuvers will be things like scrubbing the deck, man overboard, docking, rough seas. These very literal terms, these very literal Navy terms. As I said, the dances are more African inspired. And what happened is that there were competitions between the different ships, just like in a march past. Just think about Sports Day, where it would be a competition to see who has the best, who has, first of all, the most synchronized movements, and who has the most innovative responses to the different calls. So of course there will be the standard calls, and then everybody will do their own little creative take on it. So for instance, if you think about in Sports Day, they'll have marks allocated for the formation. If the house is rows of Lima, they might form a R, or they might form a rose. Or when they do their eyes right, they might do a little fancy something. So it's really the same, more or less, with the landship. So the next physical element we're looking at are people and roles. Now remember, these headings are coming directly from the syllabus, right? So the members are typically lower class African Barbadians, so Bajan people of African descent. And you will find that most, if not all, cultural forms have originated among the lower classes of these countries. And the lower class will typically be East Indian or African, of East Indian or African descent. So your role in the landship is actually allocated based off of your role in the community itself. So if you are a leader in the community, or you're a mother to many, or something like that, you take care of people a lot, then you might have a role like the nurse. So it's not to say that you are necessarily a nurse in real life. It's not to say that that is your actual job title. It's not to say that you're an engineer in real life, so they'll put you as an engineer in the landship. But if you're somebody who typically fixes things, even if you're like a carpenter in the community, then you might be an engineer in the landship, because it means that you're somebody who people go to fix things or solve things. So I'm speaking in two kinds of terms, because traditionally, as I said, each community had their own landship, but recently, well, somewhat recently, they kind of did away with that, and now there's only one landship. So there's one main Barbados Landship Committee, which is more or less managed by, I guess, their what would be the equivalent of the Ministry of Arts and Multiculturalism in Trinidad. So initially, you had to be older than 30 years to be a member. But of course, because they want to keep the tradition going, and they want to make it as accessible as possible for a lot of people and for younger people as well, they reduced it to 18 years. And now it's just primary school age. So they have very, very junior members of the landship. And then you have people who would have been in it since they were that age. So you have older people being members as well. So skipping now to symbolic elements. So we just looked at physical elements, and now we're looking at symbolic elements. As I said, these headings are coming straight out of the syllabus from pages 18 to 22, or 18 to 20. Cannot remember. So the first set of symbolic elements would be spiritual and ritualistic. So really and truly, it just symbolizes people coming together, but not just people coming together, but people who may have differences that make it difficult for them to communicate, but they still find something in common to make that communication happen and to make a community out of themselves. So it's spiritual because it is sacred. to these people. It is important to them. Spiritual does not necessarily mean it has to do with God or worship or anything like that, but it means that it actually taps into the inner being of these people. And because it is practiced repeatedly and in the same ways all the time, that is what really makes it a ritual. So anything that is done over and over in this sort of strategic manner is what you would call a ritual. In the same way that we consider carnival and juve and things like these rituals, just like we would consider religious ceremonies rituals and all that jazz. And it is, of course, ancestral because it was passed down from generation to generation, and it is community based. So all of these things would just go to say how important this is to these people because it's part of their heritage, and it's something that is important to them. It's important to their identity and their way of living. So the next set of symbolic elements, the historic. So of course, as I said, it would be historic because it was passed down from generations, and also because it's, as with most cultural forms, it speaks to a history of overcoming hardship and overcoming being marginalized, overcoming being put down or being tried to shut down by the authorities or by the people in charge. So now it's part of their national culture. It's been accepted and is now respected as something important and something that is a signifier of what it means to be Barbadian. And of course, so as I kind of mentioned, it's this thing of preserving African cultures, well, Afro-Caribbean cultures, because when our ancestors came from Africa to Trinidad, they were stripped mostly of any of their own cultures, their own language, because we don't speak African now, we speak English or French or Spanish or whatever the language of our different territories are. So, in trying to fight this, there was something called syncretism. So, that is a word for the cultural practice of where you mix your own culture with you mix the marginalized culture with the dominant culture to kind of hide the fact that you're actually practicing your own culture. So it's kind of outsmarting the system in a way. And that is sort of what happened with the landship because they combined the two cultures so that they almost can't tell that they're still practicing their African cultures that the authorities didn't want them to practice. So in itself, landship it reflects on this process of outsmarting the system of wanting to keep and hold on to our own cultures, and reclaim them and create meaning out of them. And of course, as we said, two of the theories are that the landship reflects on the Middle Passage, or even if not, it reflects on colonialism. So all these things make it historic because it's a retrospective look. It's looking back into the past and bringing it into the present and commemorating it and paying tribute to the people who came before us. Right, so another set of symbolic elements would be the economic aspect. And actually, the landship is not just a community group, but it also functions like a cooperative or a credit union or a susu. So, what happened is that because slavery had no pension plan, um, slavery did not come with any benefits. When you were old as a slave or even in the post emancipation period, there was no benefits to come to you as how we have pensions or we have health care or anything like that. Slavery had none of that. So these people created that for themselves. They created that through the landship. They created something that would be able to sustain them as a community during hard times. So they do things like save money. So I'm not sure if you know how susu works, but we will go into that as another cultural form as well. But you basically everybody puts in a certain amount of money, and then each person will have a chance to draw out um, a big lump sum of money. So they would have come together to raise funds to pay for weddings, funerals, old age pension, education, things like that. Like there are some people who speak about going to school or going to university and needing books, and they actually only ever got those books through the landship because they were too poor. Their family wasn't wealthy enough to afford things like that. And also in addition to being about money, the landship also provided community services to the fellow members or to the community. So they would come together to save you having to spend money on things like hiring a truck to move if you're moving your house, if you're moving from one house to another, I mean, or reaping crops and things like that. And it was actually so economically beneficial to these people that this just speaks to the brilliance of black cultures. It was so effective that the banks in Barbados felt very threatened by the existence of the landship. So what they did, the authorities actually many times tried to make them look bad so that people wouldn't have trust in them and would come instead to the institutions like the bank. Um, so yeah, this just goes to show how useful it really was for the people in that community that they did not need to go to the bank, and the bank felt that they did not have membership, and of course if they don't have membership then they won't make money. So that just goes to show how powerful and effective the landship was in terms of the economic value to the community. Right, so we're moving on to the influence of the landship on Barbados, more or less. So the impact on society, community, and individual would be that, of course, it gave the members, or gives the members still, a sense of belonging, and it brings people together. So they spend time constructively, whether it's that they're rehearsing for their landship performance, or they're helping out their neighbors, or they're running after school clubs for the children. All these things bring community together. And also, as I said earlier, it stopped from some people from being in positions of abject poverty because they knew that if they could not afford to feed their family, the landship would pitch in and help, especially after slavery, where there was nothing for them to claim from the government. They really had to provide for themselves. So the landship a lot of times stopped people from possibly becoming homeless because the other landship members might open up their home to members who might be evicted and things like that. And of course, the younger members had role models to look up to, and it just gave people a chance to express their creativity um, in putting these landship performances together, which will also bring the community together, and also a chance to express their identity as Afro Caribbean people, as people being descendants of enslaved people that claim their own freedom, and this identity as being a lower class Afro Caribbean person, but being proud of that and being proud of your accomplishments and what their ancestors would have accomplished for them as well. So moving on to the functions and meanings, quite this one is quite straightforward. So um, it's now used as cultural tourism because Barbados is a tourist oriented country. Their GDP, their economy, their money comes mostly out of tourism. So this is part of heritage tourism, which is where people would come to the Caribbean and want to see the history and see the arts, the aesthetic practices, the cultural forms of those people. And of course, people in Barbados look up to it, and it's a source of national pride. And also, they make an effort to keep it going, to preserve the culture for the coming generations as they did in the previous generation. So it's something that they really want to hold on to, and they don't want to lose. So it's the longest surviving indigenous Barbadian cultural form. So there are, of course, other cultural forms in Barbados, but this is the oldest one that's still in operation, and it really represents the creativity of Black people, of Bajan people, of Caribbean people in the face of oppression. So they had so many forces acting against them, but they were still able to come up with this aesthetic practice, that is so beautiful and admirable, and it's a real community effort. And so it also functions and reflects on our power to take symbols and reclaim them and make them ours. So, for instance, the symbol of the British Navy, which would have been something that really had nothing to do with us personally as Caribbean people, but taking that symbol and then turning it into something rhythmic, turning it into something aesthetic, turning it into something fun, turning it into a community based thing, turning it into something that reflects their culture as Black people. So they essentially took something that was not theirs and made it their own, and put their own flavor to it, and created something completely new out of these existing cultural forms. So the last thing we're going to look at is the relationship to contemporary culture, which is very interesting with the Landship, because there's something now called Bashment Landship, which is where, so Bashment is the other word for Bajan soca. So as you could imagine, it's more provocative, the walk up, as Bajans call it, movement, um, goes into it rather than the more traditional movement. So what happened is that there was one community who wanted to make more money, so they took the bashment music and mixed it with the landship and created some and bashment dances as well. So just picture Landship but whining and jamming, basically. And of course, people didn't quite like that because it was they saw it as defiling the culture, but you might just see it as reflecting the interests of the younger generation. So there was a huge stigma attached to it for a long time, and I guess there is still a stigma attached to it as something that is seen as kind of bastardizing this sacred culture of the landship. And in popular culture, a lot of Bajan artists, if we think about Lil Rick, think about Rupi. I mean, Rihanna doesn't sing soca, but she's a Bajan artist. I'm just giving examples here in general, not necessarily related to this point, but Bajan artists will use landship movements so that when somebody sees them, they'll say, hey, oh, that's a Bajan soca artist. That's not a Trini, because that's a landship movement and landship is not a Trini thing. Or that's not a St. Lucian artist. And this is because, of course, soca is something that is dominated by Trinidadians. So, of course, they would want to set themselves apart and be like, nah, this is bashment. This is walk up music. This is not Trini soca. This is not groovy soca. This is ours. And so, if you see this landship movement, you already know what's going to happen. You know it's not a Trini thing that's going on here. Right. So, just to wrap up, as I said, you need to watch those 4 videos on YouTube to completely understand what I just explained. It will all make sense. And of course, if you have any questions, feel completely free to ask me. The information that I got in for this PowerPoint was I actually got it from directly from two experts in two experts from Barbados, and 2 people who are members of the Landship. So, of course, there's going to be a quiz. You will complete the quiz before next week's class. Please do my work and please watch the 4 videos.